Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 146 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Joanne Harpel for this episode, and today's discussion is such an important one for families who have been touched by suicide losses for sure, and also for any parents of grieving teens from any types of death losses. Joanne tells us today about her new film, which is called Talking Out Loud, Teens and Suicide Loss, A Conversation. I have seen it, and I have to say it is such a privilege to hear directly from teens about such a sensitive topic. They knew their parents were watching live during the filming, but apparently they all forgot about that and the cameras, and they had a really honest, unfiltered discussion with us. And this is a group of 5 teens who have lost either a parent or sibling to suicide. So I'd like to thank Joanne and her team for bringing us this incredible film, and also for coming to speak with us about it this week. So before we jump into my discussion with Joanne, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. Most importantly, I wanted to make sure you've seen the brand new book, Widowed Parents Unite, which just came out recently. It is a collection of short essays from 48 different widowed parents. Lots of different people with different experiences, perspectives, dads as well as moms, and people outside the U.S. and all over within the United States. Lots of terrific perspectives, reflections, and tips really geared toward widowed parents in that first year of widowhood. Plus, I have added an introduction and conclusion, and there's a really rich section of resources in the back, not to be missed. So that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Joanne Harpel. Joanne is president of Coping After Suicide, and she is an international authority on suicide bereavement and post-vention. Her work has been recognized with the 2 highest awards in the field from the American Association of Suicidology and the International Association for Suicide Prevention. She's been invited to speak to many organizations, including the United Nations, and has trained the U.S. Army and many, many others, including doctors and teachers and mental health professionals and all sorts of people. Joanne has also spent over a decade in senior leadership with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. She is based in New York City. Joanne, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, actually, I should say welcome back to the show. I had to check. It was episode 83, which was back in September of 2020, if you can believe it, 3 years ago.
Amazing how much the world has changed in those 3 years.
I know. Thinking back to September of 2020, that was the first 6 months or so of the pandemic. And of course, September, the reason we spoke in September last time is that is Suicide Prevention Month. And now, of course, I'm speaking with you. It's November, and it's actually just a little before November 18th, which is also an important date. The Saturday before Thanksgiving, I think, is an important date in the community. Can you tell us about that?
So every year, the Saturday before Thanksgiving, this year it's November 18th, is International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. And that day was originally created in the mid-90s by resolution of the United States Senate. Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, who lost his father to suicide, got a resolution passed in the U.S. Senate declaring the Saturday before Thanksgiving to be what was then called National Survivors of Suicide Day. And when I was at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, one of the projects that I spearheaded was growing that day to an international program that takes place in several hundred cities all around the world. And they all have some sort of event or conference or program relating to survivors of suicide loss. So you can find information about that program on the website of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. But all of those different events are organized locally. And the intent is for survivors of suicide loss to not feel alone, to have a sense of community, but also to have access to information and resources and guidance and information about how to cope with this incredibly heartbreaking and difficult loss.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We'll find the link to the FSP information about that day so that if people want to get involved, I think when this episode comes out, it'll be shortly before the 18th. So there'll be some time to get hooked up with that if anybody would like to. Let me ask, how did you get involved in working with survivors of suicide loss?
I was a 29-year-old corporate lawyer in New York City, working at a big fancy law firm. And my younger brother, Stephen, who was 26, took his own life. Steve was an honors graduate of Yale, had gone on to Harvard Law School, was married to his college sweetheart, and had, up until the year before he died, lived a normal, healthy, productive, vibrant life, but very acutely developed bipolar disorder, which I now know, I didn't know anything about it at the time, but I now know it can be an adult onset illness. And particularly men in their 20s, that can be a time that it can manifest. And that's what happened to him. And so he went from being healthy, mentally healthy, to being very, very sick very quickly. And we tried as hard as we could to get him the best help we could find, but we ran out of time. And from the time he was first diagnosed until the time he took his own life was less than a year.
Wow.
So my world was turned upside down, as you can imagine. And I remember actually just a couple of months after he died was International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day on a much smaller scale. And I remember going to a program on that day and walking in and looking around the room and seeing all of these people who had also lost someone to suicide. And it was stunning to me that there was actually a whole community of human beings who had been through this experience, because I felt so alone and so alienated. And I remember listening to some of them speak about their experiences. These were people whose losses had been several years before, and they were presenting at the conference. And I remember thinking, through the haze of my grief, I think I'm going to do that someday. And I didn't really have a vision of what I even meant by that. I just had this sort of gut sense that if I could get the ground steady under my feet, that this could be a direction that I might really want to go with my life. And so I ended up over the course of the next number of years making a pretty big career change and left law practice. And now for more than 20 years have been devoted professionally to the whole area of what we call suicide postvention, what happens after the suicide.
For the family members and loved ones and the people who survived somebody close to them dying by suicide.
That's right. So it can be individuals, it can be families, it can be communities, it can be workplaces, schools. So the universe of postvention includes a lot of bereavement support, of course, as you would imagine, but it also includes educating professionals who come in contact with survivors of suicide loss: clergy, funeral directors, first responders, educators, people who find themselves not necessarily having had a personal loss, but working with people who have. And how do you go about creating an environment where people feel supported and can get through this loss intact?
Okay. And you mentioned that you were 29, but I think you also had some younger siblings when your brother died.
I did. So at the time Steve died, I was 29, but I had a 19-year-old sister and a 15-year-old brother at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Steve died in 1993. This year was the 30th anniversary of when he died. And my brother and sister, who were teenagers at the time, there was nothing out there for them in the voices of other teens. Absolutely nothing. My brother and sister are now 45 and 49, and there's still nothing out there for them in the voices of other teens. There are materials for teens, but they are all written by adults. There has been nothing up until now where it was teens available to speak about their experience in their own voice that was easily accessible and widely available for other teens.
Aha. Okay. So this, of course, brings us to the topic of today's discussion. I invited you here because you have a new film, which I think is really, really important. It's called Talking Out Loud, Teens and Suicide Loss, A Conversation. And at the start of the film, I noticed there's some numbers on the screen. It says every year in the U.S., nearly 1 million young people lose someone they love to suicide. And then it goes on to say most of them will deal with this alone. And that was really striking.
Most of us who've had anything to do with teenagers or who were a teenager ourselves know that while some teens are open to the idea of going to therapy or going to a support group or going to a bereavement camp, and all of those programs are wonderful, many teens are not open to that. Many teens will talk to their family about what they're going through, but many teens won't. What we also know about teens is that they want to fit in. They don't want to be different. They want to be part of the group. They want to be in the mainstream of where their peers are. And most teenagers have never been through the suicide of a parent or the suicide of a sibling. And so for those who have, they don't have any idea of where to go or who to talk to, where to find people who've been through an experience like theirs. They want to fit in with their peers. Their friends don't really have a clue what they're going through, and they're not necessarily so inclined to go to therapy or go to a support group. And so what ends up happening as a practical matter is they're kind of bushwhacking through it on their own without much of a sense of what the experience is like for other teens who've gone before them. And that was true in my family of my brother and sister. They were sort of in a situation where they had to figure out on their own how to find the support that they needed, but it was very difficult for them.
So my next question was going to be, why did you make this film? But I think you've maybe just answered it. There's this gap that you're looking to fill.
There is a huge gap. And another piece of why I felt it was important to make this is that in all of the years that I was working on the International Survivors of Suicide Loss program, back when I was with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, we would put together each year, as part of this program, we would put together a group of 5 or 6 survivors of suicide loss who were talking about their experiences. And we always wanted to find a cross section. We would want to include a mother who'd lost a child and someone who'd lost a spouse and so on. And in those years that we were able to include a teen in that discussion, we would get feedback from all over the world saying it was a really great program. I just wish we could have heard more from the teen. And in those years that we didn't include a teen, because you can't include everybody, every
Sure.
relationship and every demographic every year. In those years that we didn't include a teen, we would get feedback from all over the world saying, great program. I wish there had been a teenager that we could have heard from. And so I also had a sense, completely separate from what I had seen in my own family, I had a sense professionally that there was also a hunger on the part of adults to hear from in the voices of the teens. They wanted to get us sort of be brought under the tent and into the experience of the teens, because many adults who've had a suicide loss have teens in their lives that they want to support, and they feel in the dark about what the teen experience is like.
Mm-hmm. And I've watched it, and thank you for sharing a screener version with me. As a parent, not with suicide loss, but a parent of grieving teens, it's powerful to see directly into those teens. So can you tell us a little bit about, it's an hour-long film, what's kind of the structure and approach that you take in the film?
So what we wanted to do was give whoever was watching the film, whether it was a teen or an adult who cares about a teen, a little bit of a window into what the teen experience of losing a loved one to suicide is. So the first thing we do in the film is we have them in conversation with one another facilitated by my colleague, Stephen Kuriskis, who facilitates our Coping After Suicide Teens group. We have a national suicide bereavement support group for teens. Information about that is at copingaftersuicide.com. And so we had 5 alumni from that teens group in conversation with Steve, who is the facilitator of the group, so that everyone who's watching the film is sort of listening in, as if they, almost as if they were listening in on a teen support group meeting. These are the kinds of things that the teens talk about with one another when they're open about their loss. So that's the first piece. And while that was being filmed, I was in another room with the family members they had brought with them, the adult family members. And we were all watching that process on a screen, on a monitor.
Live as it was happening?
Live as it was happening.
Wow.
So we had an awareness of what the teens were talking about, but in almost every case, what the family members were hearing during the filming was new to them. It wasn't necessarily things that even their own teens had shared with them in real life. They had just as much of a bird's eye view into what was going on in their teens as the audience had. And so then the second part of the film, we bring everyone together. We reunite the teens with the adult family members that they had come with that day. And we engage everyone in a conversation so that they can reflect together on what that experience was like, and the adults can let their teens know what they heard and how it landed, and the teens then felt an ability to reflect back to their adults about what they needed and wanted through this experience.
Aha. One question comes to mind. You mentioned that you and the adults were in a separate room watching. Did the teens know that their family members were watching?
Yes, the teens knew before we ever started filming. When we reached out to the teens who had been in our teens group to see if they were interested in being in the film, we explained what the whole process was going to be. We didn't want any surprises. There were no gotcha moments.
Right.
So the teens and the adults all knew in advance that what was going to be happening is that when the teens were being filmed, the adults would be watching. And then we would all be reunited. So the teens knew that their parents were watching. But what was interesting is that afterwards, the teens, I asked them, did you have in mind that your mom or your dad was in the other room watching?
Like, were they filtering or something what they were saying based on that?
Exactly. Were they self-conscious? Did they even remember? Did they even have it in mind? And all of them said, maybe for the first couple of minutes, but after that, I was so involved and engrossed in the conversation I was having with the other teens and with Steve, and that I really completely forgot that anybody else was listening. And what was interesting is not only did they forget that their parents were listening, but they also were able to tune out the cameras. Don't forget this, we're doing this, it's a film, so that there are 30 crew members and 4 cameras and microphones and lights, and they were able to really be so present with one another and with the experience that even that didn't distract them. So it was really pretty remarkable.
That's incredible. I mean, and let me just say, as a parent of teenagers, I mean, what a privilege to be. You've created this opportunity for an inside view that we might not otherwise see.
That was the hope. That was the expectation. But we didn't know until we were all sitting there in the room in real time whether that was actually going to be what we were able to capture on film.
Yeah.
And it is amazing. It is absolutely, you could feel it in the room, and it's turned out that you can feel it when you watch it too. You can really have that lived experience sense that you're being welcomed in, and that the teens are letting us hear what's really true for them.
I mean, this is going to sound like a broken record, but this is important, right? Like, I mean, this is one of the reasons I interview, one kind of category, if you will, of people that I interview is people who are grown up, but when they were a kid or a teen, they lost a parent. And I feel like that's important to try to get at the perspective of grieving kids and teens. Right now, I'm talking to grown up grieving kids and teens, but that's been kind of the closest I've been able to get to having parents get some kind of view into the types of things grieving kids and grieving teens are going through, right? By talking to people who live the experiences that their own kids are living. And you've taken it a step further here. I mean, you're talking to the actual teens. And as I recall, there were 5 of them. I think they were mostly 14, 15, and 16. And there was a 19-year-old. And I think there was one person who lost a parent, one person who lost a step parent, and 3 people who lost siblings. So we've got a good representation of experiences there. And then the parents, and in one case, a close family friend in the viewing room. And one of the things that I noticed, one of the boys mentioned that his mom had bought him a bunch of grief books. And he said, well, 2 things I noticed about it. First of all, he said, well, the books didn't really help. But the fact that his mother was trying, like the fact that his mother bought these books for him in an attempt to help, like just that part was helpful, knowing that his mother was kind of trying to help. And then it was also interesting, he circled back later and he said, well, the reason those books weren't helpful was they were all written by adults who were writing for a teen audience, I think maybe in the case of most of the books, but they weren't teens and they didn't really get it.
Yeah, you've captured beautifully an example of the kind of moment that was so powerful in the film, because so many parents of grieving teens, because they're grieving themselves,
right,
feel so lost about what their teens need and how to help. And the parents are flailing and are trying so hard to help, and they don't know whether they're hitting the mark or not. And what was so powerful about what that young man said was the fact that my mom was trying to help meant so much to me. She didn't have to get it perfectly right. But knowing that she cared and knowing that she was trying to connect with me, that really mattered to me. And it also mattered to him that the kind of resource that was out there, that there were some gaps, that he was craving some other kinds of content, some other kinds of information that simply wasn't available, but it didn't change his appreciation for the fact that his mom was trying.
Right, right. Yeah, I was really glad that he shared that. And also, one of the teens mentioned feeling pressure to grieve according to the so-called 5 steps, and he felt guilty, and they talked about pressure, not even from their family members maybe necessarily, but from media or from Instagram or from society to grieve in a certain way. And like how useful having a group like this, you mentioned they were all alumni of your program, a group like this to process, like, again, apart from that kind of societal pressure and realize that they could grieve in their own ways, how helpful that was to them.
One of the themes that came up over and over was that grieving, the word grieving, captures a very wide range of thoughts and feelings and emotions and experiences. And grieving doesn't always look like crying. And many of the teens talked about how what they mostly felt was numb. What they mostly felt was nothing from time to time or for long periods of time. And so they didn't realize until they had a sense from hearing that from others that feeling of having no feeling, of being numb, is itself often part of grieving. And so I think it can set off a little bit of a chain reaction where the teens are feeling numb. Not all of them, not all the time, but the teens who are feeling numb don't have much affect that looks like grieving. And so the parents are freaking out because they think their kids aren't processing it. The kids are freaking out because they think they're doing it wrong, or they feel guilty, or, maybe I didn't love my dad as much as I thought I did because I'm not crying, or, there's this sort of meta story that we all get pulled into about what grieving is supposed to look like. There are no 5 stages of grieving. That's not a thing. It's not real. But many people think that it is. And so both the teens themselves and the parents worry that there's something wrong with their teen. And the teens have no way to reality check it against other teens because they don't know any other teens who've been through it.
Right.
And so I think there was reassurance available in a lot of different ways through this discussion that comes out in the film. The kids felt reassured to know that that what they were feeling was common or typical or normal, and the parents could feel reassured that just because their kids weren't crying and talking about their loss didn't mean that they weren't grieving.
Yeah. Okay. So that was one of the things that really struck me when the kids were together in their group talking without the adults around, except for, of course, the moderator. How thoughtful they were, and how, like, I don't know, like you mentioned that some of the parents were worried, maybe some of these parents, maybe parents in general, if their kid isn't sharing with them, they're not grieving or whatever, that as these kids were talking amongst themselves, you could see there was a lot going on there, and they're very thoughtful and reflective and handling it in their own ways. And I was really impressed with when you get teens kind of outside of adults talking amongst themselves. I don't know how deep some of it is.
There was so much poise in the room where the kids were talking. They were thoughtful, they were sensitive, they were talking about very tender, vulnerable material and content. What they were saying was not sanitized or superficial, but the way they spoke had a huge amount of poise and very little emotion. The parents who were in the room with me, we were going through boxes and boxes of tissues while we were listening to the kids. There was so much more raw emotion, tears, and evident emotion on the part of the parents than there was on the part of the teens at the very same moment. And I think it was a powerful realization for the parents. Again, it reinforced that just because their kids' affect may look calm or may look poised or may look resilient doesn't mean that they're not thinking very deeply about what this experience is. At one point in the conversation, the kids started talking about, these are teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old, saying things like, I now realize my brother is never going to get to be an uncle to my kid someday, right? Or my dad isn't going to walk me down the aisle. The fact that these kids are actually thinking about, of course, those are the very same things that we as adults think about, but you don't necessarily realize that a 14-year-old who just lost their sibling is also thinking about the fact that when they have kids someday, 20 years from now, their sibling won't be available to be an uncle. It's so deep and it's so true. What these kids were sharing was so true. But many of the adults were hearing about it for the very first time in real time.
And as I recall, most of their losses were at least a couple of years prior. It wasn't like they were hearing this for the first time because this was a fresh loss and they just, it happened 2 months ago and they hadn't talked about it yet or something. Like, these were families where the loss had been at least 2 years ago, I think. And theoretically, there could have been time to talk about it. It just hadn't come up or hadn't been part of the dialogue.
That's right. And there are a few reasons for that. I mean, we tried as hard as we could when we were making decisions about which kids to include in the film. We didn't want to include kids whose loss was very, very recent. We wanted to make sure that they had enough healing of their own that it wouldn't feel exploitative and potentially damaging to film them. Someone whose loss was very, very recent, that would have not been something I would have been comfortable doing.
Sure.
But the fact that a year or 2 years or longer had passed since the actual loss and certain things hadn't come up speaks to exactly why we're making the film, because so much doesn't come up. Some of the kids said, I don't want to talk about certain things because I know my mom is upset already. She's having a hard time already. I don't want to burden her. So it's not that the kids are refusing to talk or punishing the parents, or the parents aren't connected to the kids and aren't asking questions. There's nothing negative in why the conversations aren't happening. It's just that they often don't happen organically.
Right. Well, and that's a very important point that you mentioned there. And this actually, for any, regardless of the type of loss, it could be a suicide loss, it could be any other type of loss. It is a very common thing in children's grief that the kids don't want to upset their surviving parent by sharing necessarily some of their grief or all of their grief. Like it is a very common thing that comes up. And I feel like as a parent, it's important for me to kind of keep that in mind, that there's probably more going on there than they're sharing, and, keep that door open and look for ways to open the door to those discussions, knowing that they might not volunteer some things, and I might need to kind of try to facilitate that, those discussions a bit.
And of course, one of the other things that makes it even more complicated is these kids are going through developmentally exactly the age when they are already differentiating from their parents, and already keeping things more private, and already making different kinds of decisions about how much they share with their parents and how much they don't share with their parents, because that is what teenagers do, whether they're grieving or not. Right. And so when you then add the overlay of the grief, and then when you add the particular cause of death, in terms of suicide, what can often happen is that the parents are so scared that because suicide has happened in the family, that the surviving family members are now at risk. That fear, that terror is so operative. And especially if the parents feel as though the person who took their life didn't tell me that they were in trouble, didn't tell me that they were at risk, I didn't know what was going on.
Right.
If that was the experience around the suicide itself, and now they've got a teenager who's playing things close to the vest, who isn't bringing them under the tent, it precipitates panic in the parents.
Sure.
Even though there may not be anything actually worrisome going on, it feels really scary. And so what can happen is the parents can end up sort of, the term is being hypervigilant, with the way the kids experience it is being smothered, being hounded, right? That the parents are so worried that they want the kids to talk about it at the very moment that that's not necessarily what the kids are feeling like doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I recall in the wrap-up discussion, you mentioned the second half of the film, you led a discussion with the parents and the teens together. And one of the boys, I think, and his mother ended up saying, like, one of the things I'm taking away from this is I'm going to trust your process in this, and trust, that you will come to me, when you need help or whatever. I forget exactly what she said and what he said, but it seemed like there was a bit of a breakthrough there in understanding.
If I'm thinking, a couple of the moms said something similar, but one of the ones I'm thinking of in particular said to her son, I'll back off. I'll back off. And his response was, thanks.
Yeah.
That there's a real push-pull that both the parents and the kids feel about wanting to be connected and needing each other. These kids still really need their parents. Mm-hmm. And also they need a sense of, and crave a sense of agency, and want their own ability to make the decision about whether they're going to talk about it, who they're going to talk about it with, when they're going to talk about it, what they're going to say, how much they want to share, what situations they want it to come up in or not come up in. They want a sense of control over this process, and they will claim it if the parents don't give it to them, they will claim it.
Yeah. Well, and I noticed, because at the very end of the film, you and Steve then debriefed a bit about it. And that was one of the points you mentioned. You had noticed how much the kids were looking for that agency. And I guess I felt like after watching them in their discussion, more confident that, like, yeah, they've got this, right? Like, not saying like they don't need any help or whatever, but I'm just saying, like, they just seem much more competent and thoughtful than maybe people give teens credit for.
I think that's right. And I also think they were able to make a much greater allowance for the fact that their parents were lost and didn't know quite what to do. Right. There were several times that the parents said, I don't know if I'm getting it right. I don't know. One father said, my daughter, so this was a family where it was a father who was there with his daughter, and they had lost the other child in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, sometimes my daughter and I just sit at the kitchen table holding hands because
Yeah.
I really don't feel like I know what to say to her
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
make it better.
Right.
And I said, so then I asked her, how does it feel that that's the best your dad can do, is just to sit and hold your hand? And she said, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
So the kids were able to handle it when the parents said, I'm flailing. I don't know exactly what to do here. And one of the mothers said, we're not taught to parent from a big I don't know place.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Which I thought was a really brilliant thing to say. We're not. We as parents, we put such pressure on ourselves to help our kids. And the aftermath of suicide is a situation where no one is quite sure what to do for themselves, never mind for their teenage child. And the kids had a lot of grace around that, a lot of forbearance.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and she's right. Like, you feel like you have to have all the answers, and for the things that we've dealt with so far, like, why do I have to wear my seatbelt? Well, so you don't get killed or injured if we get in a car crash. Like, there's a reason, and I can know that reason, right? Why do I have to eat my vegetables? Well, it's good for your health and your body, whatever, right? Like, but there are so many things, like you're saying, that we don't know the answer to, and parenting in those situations in that place is scary.
And I think one of the themes that came through in the film was that the kids could handle that. They didn't need for their parents to have all the answers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What they wanted was a sense that their parents were right there with them through this experience.
Yes. Such an important point. Switching gears slightly, one of the other themes or topics that came up actually in the discussion, the moderator asked the teens about things that came up in school, either special school programs, and they do like a mental health day or suicide speaker or different things like that. And or also there's a brief mention of curriculum things, like what might come up in literature, he mentioned. I would have loved to hear some more about that. I heard from a family recently that was surprised in 11th grade English class that the Camus, the myth of Sisyphus. I only remember that as like the guy who pushes the rock up the hill and then it goes back down and then he pushes the rock back up and he's condemned to do that for his whole life. But apparently in the book, the central question that Camus is asking in the book is, if life is pointless, does that require suicide as the answer? And apparently at the end of the book, his conclusion is no, that's not the answer. That, we have to decide that Sisyphus is content pushing the rock up and down the hill. I don't know, something like that. But the point is, like, this is an 11th grade English class entertaining these themes in their discussions. And I can imagine that a child with any sort of grief or trauma, and particularly a child with, or teen, a high school student with a suicide loss close to them, I mean, that might be traumatic and everything awful.
Suicide is a theme in a lot of literature and plays and movies and music. I mean, we all read Romeo and Juliet, right? It's there. Yeah. It's there. And it's, so the teens weren't necessarily saying they want all of that sanitized. They just didn't like to be caught unawares. It was really upsetting to them to discover in the middle of an assignment that there was a suicide. So they appreciated getting a heads up about it from the teachers, but they weren't necessarily saying that they shouldn't, that those books should be pulled from the curriculum or anything like that. The things that tended to bother the teens more were when people would make sort of glib remarks like, oh, if I get a C on that test, I'm going to kill myself. When people used suicide in an insensitive way, that really bothered them. And the other thing that really bothered them was when schools, in their zeal to address the issue of suicide, so this typically happens when there's a suicide of a young person, schools often aren't sure how to react. Actually, just before we started this recording, I checked my email and I had an email from a school system where there had been a suicide of a student and they wanted to bring me in to consult with them. So that's an example of work that I do a lot. And often what schools want to do as soon as there's been a suicide in a school community is to right away do suicide prevention programming. And so one of the things, which is something we caution against, that's not, the timing is typically much, much better if they wait a little bit and not rush in and do suicide prevention programming right away. And there are a whole variety of reasons for that. But basically the kids in the film were saying the same thing. It just shines such a spotlight on them. They feel so self-conscious that there was a suicide in the family. And now all of a sudden the school is doing a big suicide prevention program, and everybody in the school knows that it has something to do with them and their family. And it made them really uncomfortable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And one of the boys mentioned, I think he was saying, maybe it was specifically in English class, that like his teacher would give him a heads up, okay, we're going to read this book next and this parent dies, or, whatever the case might be. And he talked about how much he appreciated, just like you said, that kind of heads up that was coming so they weren't caught unaware.
That's right. And so that it didn't come out in front of the class, right?
Yeah.
A heads up privately so that the kid could decide how they wanted to handle it, as opposed to discovering it in real time in front of all their friends.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Gosh, there's so much to talk about here. And well, actually, before I forget, let me ask. So the film is coming out when and how can people watch it?
So the film is having its sort of official premiere at a very small private event on International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day, where we're bringing the kids who were in the film back, and we're having just a private gathering. But the film itself is going to be available free of charge online on YouTube, on Vimeo, on the Coping After Suicide website. The idea is that the film will be available as a public service, free of charge to anyone, anywhere, forever. So the film itself is 60 minutes long, and we're also right now in the process of creating both a 10-minute and a 20-minute version of it as well, so that it could also be used as part of bereavement camps or support groups, or for school psychologists or funeral homes. We wanted to make it as versatile and practical as possible. So if people are interested in finding the film and watching it, the name of it is Talking Out Loud: Teens and Suicide Loss, a Conversation. So if they just put that, search on YouTube or Vimeo, they'll find it. They can also go to my website, which is copingaftersuicide.com, find it there. And then I also have a small nonprofit which collaborated with copingaftersuicide.com, and they can find it on that website, which is rethinktheconversation.org.
Okay, terrific. So as this episode drops, it'll be like a few days before November 18th, which is International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. So on November 18th, you guys will have your debut private screening. And then I'll actually go ahead and add the link the day after that. I think that's when it'll be available for public free viewing online. I'll put the link in the show notes probably on the 19th of November. So if you're listening to this, you can come back also here to the podcast and find a link directly to or Google it, like Joanne said, to find the link to watch that. And, I think that if your family has been touched by suicide loss, then this is a very important film. And I also think that if your family has grieving teens for other types of death losses as well, it's still an important, it is also an important film, because this is one particular type of loss, but these themes of teens and grief and their sharing and their introspection and their getting an inside look, I think is very relevant for all types of losses, in addition, of course, to suicide losses.
I would absolutely agree with that. My particular vantage point has to do with suicide loss, but right. So many of the themes and messages that came out of the film are absolutely relevant to other kinds of loss. Yeah.
Good. Okay, good. So we'll put up the link for sure. And then a few maybe general, one of the girls I noticed in the film said, I feel like I'm carrying around a secret that isn't even mine. And that got me thinking, I wonder if you could share with us, in your experience, you've worked with lots of survivors. What are some of the kind of common struggles that come up for survivors of suicide loss? What are some of the most common things they're struggling with?
Suicide is a topic that makes most people really uncomfortable. It's something that most people don't know very much about. And what little they know tends to come from pretty uninformed sources. One of the things I'll do often when I'm running a support group, a suicide loss support group, I'll ask everyone in the group, before you had a personal loss to suicide, what did you know about why people kill themselves? And what was the source of that information? Right. And most people say, I thought it was from people who went crazy, or people who couldn't cope with their life, or people who were where there was really something wrong with them, or came from a bad family. Most people's understanding of what leads to suicide is very uninformed, not because they're don't want to be well informed. It's just not a topic most people are very familiar with. And then I'll say, all right, where did you learn about that view of suicide? What's the source of that information? And often they don't even know where it came from. Or they'll say, yeah, there was a suicide in my hometown when I was in 8th grade. But so it's just a topic that most people don't have a very robust understanding of, A. B, it's also a topic that historically has had a huge amount of stigma and taboo around it. Almost every major faith tradition teaches that suicide is either they call it a sin or functionally they treat it as a sin. And there are all kinds of very understandable reasons for that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has meant that stigma has persisted and has stuck. And so it's something that people tend to feel very judgy about. They'll say things like, well, my sister never would have left us, right? There's a lot of judgment, which comes typically from a combination of fear and discomfort and ignorance. And I'm not using ignorance in a judgmental way. I'm using it in a very literal way. People just don't know much about what leads someone to take their life. And so it's really hard when you come from a family where there's been a suicide, not to feel like everyone is looking at you thinking there must be something wrong with you and your family because someone in your family died by suicide. It's very, very hard not to judge yourself and not to feel judged by people around you. And so most people don't feel especially understood or supported. It's a very lonely, alienating experience. And the other thing is, grieving is not a very efficient or neat process. It takes a really long time and it's messy. And most people find that everyone else around them has gone back to regular life way before our need for support is done. And that also reinforces that it's just a very lonely place to be. Grieving is a very lonely place to be for many, many people.
Okay, thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to our discussion back in episode 83, because we went deep on a lot of these things. You had tons of terrific advice and information and reflections and suggestions in that discussion in episode 83. And then also I'm going to put links in the show note to episode 84 with Melissa D'Arabian, whose mother died of suicide when Melissa was like 19. I think she was in college. And she, of course, is used to be on the Food Network. And I think you've crossed paths with her in your AFSP work as well.
I have, yeah.
She's been very involved with them, and I think on the board was on the board there. And then also episode 128 with Sandra Began, whose husband died by suicide, and her boys were maybe late elementary school, middle school kind of age at the time, and they're a bit older now. And we had a really terrific discussion as well with about her family's experience.
Yeah, I know both Melissa and Sandra, and they are both remarkable women. And Sandra's kids now have both graduated college and are doing beautifully. But it was hard. It's hard to parent kids who are going through something as difficult as losing a parent to suicide when you are also grieving yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll point people to all those discussions because those are terrific. I do want to, before we end here, because we've mentioned that you have a teen group. I think you have a bunch of other groups. Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of support and services that you offer at Coping After Suicide?
Sure. So Coping After Suicide is my practice, and I work nationwide. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm an expert in suicide loss, and I've been doing this work for more than 20 years. So I work one-on-one with individuals who've lost someone to suicide. I also work with couples and with families. And then we have, starting in January, we'll be up to 18 national suicide bereavement support groups. So we have a group just for teens. We also have a group for 20-somethings. We'll have a group for 30-somethings. We have groups for siblings, for spouses and partners and significant others, for mothers who've lost a child, for fathers who've lost a child, for adults who've lost a parent. So these are all suicide loss specific, but they are open to people anywhere in the country. They meet by Zoom, and they're all professionally facilitated. So they're not therapy groups, they're peer support groups, but they're all facilitated. Each group is facilitated by a professional who's had a personal loss to suicide, but also many, many years of experience with group facilitation. So this particular film is about teens, and we have resources to help teens, but we also want to make sure that the other family members are taken care of as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to put a link also in the show notes to those groups and encourage people for whom that's relevant to check it out. Anytime I hear from someone, or I hear from a listener, or reader, or actually just last week I was giving a webinar. Allison Gilbert hosted a webinar, and she was talking with me and with Barry Liner Grant. And one of the questions in the chat box was like something about resources for survivors of suicide loss. And so I said, okay, well, you have to go to Coping After Suicide. Like, I dropped the link in the chat, and that's start there. So yeah, I think what you guys are doing is terrific. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to all these things. And the film, again, is called Talking Out Loud, Teens and Suicide Loss, A Conversation. And again, if you're listening and you're thinking, my family hasn't been touched by suicide loss, but some other type of loss, I still think it's very worth watching this film. If you have a grieving teen, or even a kid who's a little younger than teen, but will be a teen soon. And then, of course, if your family's been affected by suicide losses and you have teens involved, then definitely it's a very important contribution, I think, to the discourse and to the understanding of this topic, for parents and then for people in general. So thank you for doing this film. I'm glad you've done this.
Thank you. I really appreciate our conversation. I'm reminded of when we spoke 3 years ago, just how you two have turned something so tragic and hard in your life into something meaningful. And I wish our paths had crossed for any other reason, but yeah. I'm glad that they have, and I just admire you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Next time I'm in New York, or if you're ever in Seattle, we'll have to get together. That'd be fun.
It's a date.
All right. I almost forgot my wrap-up question here, which I will just ask you because I like to ask all my guests. If you could say one thing to survivors of suicide loss, what would you say? Leave us with some final thoughts here.
What I would say is that coping with the suicide of someone you love is really hard. And it is not a linear, nice, neat, step-by-step process. It's very real and very messy, and takes longer than you wish it would, and has more twists and turns than you may anticipate. But you can absolutely come through it. You can be yourself again. You can feel hopeful. You can have a future that is meaningful and a sense of purpose. And it is absolutely possible to continue to carry your loved one with you as you continue to move through your own life.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Joanne Harpel of Coping After Suicide. And Joanne, tell us once again your website, please.
copingaftersuicide.com.
All right. Fantastic. Joanne, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Joanne Harpel as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Just look for episode 146. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening, and until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.